Welcome to Introduction to Communication. I'm Dr. Rick Curry, and today, a quick overview of our Chapter 1 assignment. We're going to examine what is communication and why do we study it. So we're going to be looking at those two key tenets in today's lecture. Now, I'd like to start most lectures with something fun. This one is communication based. This is a mother using communication to call her children into the room.
Hannah Collin, run in here and come get y'all juice. Shit.
Now, maybe that didn't quite work out the way the mom had expected. She was pranking her children using communication, and her children were good listeners. They came running as she called them into the room, and then the disaster happened. Let's look at it one more time.
Hannah Collin, run in here and come get y'all juice. Shit.
So hopefully you're not having a bad day, but if you are having a bad day, then hopefully that made it just a little bit brighter and at least made you laugh a little bit. So let's go ahead and start by examining what communication is. Communication is defined as a process, meaning it isn't spontaneous. Most of the time, we don't just spontaneously decide to communicate. It's planned out. We think about it. We think about what we're going to say, how we're going to say it. If we're going to use nonverbals, hand, body language in conjunction with that message. So it's usually not spontaneous. There's a lot of thought that goes into communication. Now, because it is a process, that's important because anything that is a process means that with practice and preparation, we can become better at it. It's like being an athlete. A football player doesn't become a star athlete the first time he steps out onto a football field. It takes practice, it takes time and effort and energy, but over a course of time, that skill set can be improved. It's the same thing with communication. We can build and we can work on it, which is important and we'll talk about later. Now, the second key element of communication is that it involves the use of symbols. Now, symbols can be the letters that we use, words that we use. It's the meaning associated behind things. And because communication is constantly evolving, that knowledge base of what symbols are and what symbols mean is important to keep up with. So, for instance, I have younger brothers. They use words that I didn't use when I was in college. They have no meaning to me. So communication has evolved. They have symbols and words that mean new things all of the time, and that's an important element and tenet of communication. That ties into this last component, which is that communication involves a sharing or an exchange of meaning. And it is constantly evolving, just like we talked about in the example with my brothers and the words that they used, because our language changes, the meaning changes, right? How many of your parents have ever said, "What are you talking about?" Right? When you've said something that maybe your friends get or your friends understand, but the language, the way that you said something, the phrasing, doesn't make sense to your parents or someone else who may be from older generation, right? Because communication is a process that involves symbols, that involves a sharing or exchange of meaning. Let's look at it in a little bit different way that might help explain it in more detail. Let's look at the letter C. When you see that C there on the screen, what does it mean to you, if anything? Right? For me, it's the letter of my last name, but when I see a C, it really doesn't have any particular meaning to me. When we group that with the letter A, now maybe it starts to have meaning. I see C and I see A, and I combine that together, and maybe I see California, right? CA is the abbreviation for the state of California. Maybe you don't have any association or with California, so maybe you don't see anything when you see CA. However, your brain is thinking ahead. So your brain is already thinking, what letter is going to come next? What do you think? What letter is going to come next? Most of you probably put an R there, car, right? How many of you, when you see C-A-R in conjunction, have an image of a car pop into your head? How many of you saw your own car? Right? Those three letters, independent of each other, may have little or no meaning or value to us. However, because communication is a process that involves the use of symbols for the exchange of meaning, each of these letters is a symbol that may or may not mean anything until placed together. But when we combine them together, now C-A-R has meaning. It means car. What is a car? It's a form of transportation, right? At some point in time in your life, someone has told you that C-A-R means car, and that car is something that you use primarily for transportation, to get from point A to point B. However, let's take the R away, right? Now we have C-A. If you didn't think car earlier when C-A was present, you probably saw C-A-T, cat. How many of you just had an image of a cat pop into your head? Right? Probably most of you. If I said C-A-T, cat, and an image of a horse popped into your head, that would mean that the communication and the meaning there, the use of symbols, is very different for you than for most people. Right? Maybe you saw a black cat or a white cat. A lot of that has to do with your field of experiences. And field of experiences is something that we'll talk about here shortly. Right? So another important aspect of communication is what we call relational objectives. And this says that we will change the way we communicate based on how we define and view the relationships. So for instance, you will talk differently to your boss than you will talk to a colleague or a coworker. Right? The conversations you have will be different. The language you use will be different. You'll talk to your friends differently than you will talk to your partner, your spouse, right? The words you use, the language, the way you communicate will differ. You will probably talk different to your parent than you talk to a teacher. And you will likely talk different to a pastor, a spiritual leader, or a mentor than you would in how you talk to your friends. Right? We call that relational objectives. The way we communicate changes based off of how we define and view the relationship. So you see the image there of a nice grandmother sitting in her chair reading a book. You will likely speak differently to your grandmother than you speak to your friends. You will probably not go into Thanksgiving dinner at your grandmother's house and start cursing at your grandmother. You'll probably get slapped, right? My grandmother would not appreciate that. However, you may sit around with your friends and you may curse, and it's completely fine because the accepted idea of language and how you communicate is different because of the different relationship. And so that's relational objectives. Now, sometimes those relational objectives can be skewed. For instance, this is a grandmother on Instagram who has a quite large following, who sort of violates the norm or the expectations of how a grandmother should communicate. Right? You can follow her, Batty Winkle, on Instagram. Quite hilarious. Again, she breaks the norms of what a grandmother should do. This is my personal favorite, her Kanye West t-shirt. Her eating ice cream mimicking the image on the shirt, right? So just a fun way. Sometimes those relationships do violate our traditional norms of how we think they should be. Now let's look at a classic communication model. Now your textbook highlights this in a very similar way, but this is an easy way to really understand the classic communication model. It says that there is a source of a message. Right? So someone is originating that message. That message is then being delivered to an audience, or what we call receivers. And that message has to be communicated via some form of channel. So in a classic classroom setting, you're going to have the instructor as the source of the message in front of an audience. Right? So that channel is going to be face-to-face communication. They're going to be delivering a message to the receiver, to the students. Those students are then going to provide feedback to the instructor. So they may nod their head in agreement. They may raise their hand to ask questions. They may shake their head, or they may look discouraged if they're not completely understanding something. So there's a source, there's a channel for the message to a receiver, and then there's feedback. So if we think about our class, our online class, Very similar. Source of the information here is me as the instructor. The channel I'm using, however, has changed. That channel is now online, right? It's audio, it's maybe videos, but it's not face-to-face. So that channel for that message is different. The feedback then becomes different as well. I'm not in front of you, so I can't see your facial, your nonverbal expressions to see if you're understanding the content. So it can become a little bit tricky based off of that. Now, there are also some different components here that have made the classic communication model outdated, right? We now use email regularly. We use instant messaging, phone messages, SMS or text messages, internet. Use Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat. There's a whole host of mediums, of channels that you use to communicate through. And so that classic model has become a little bit outdated. And that's because it doesn't account for what we call noise, right? Noise is two parts. It's everything that is occurring around you that may affect your ability to hear a message or understand a message. And then as a result, it may change your ability to generate feedback to the sender of that message. So there's two types of noise. There's internal noise. That's the thoughts inside your head. I'm busy, right? I've got so much to do. Your instructor's here and maybe they're lecturing you in a math class. And in your head, all you're thinking about is, gosh, I've got so much work to do today. I've got to do this when I get home. Maybe you're hungry. Maybe you have to go to the bathroom. Maybe you need to place a phone call, right? That's internal noise. That's everything that's going on inside your head that can impact the delivery, the reception of a message and feedback. There's also external noise, actual noise, right? Noise that exists in the environment. Maybe it's someone's cell phone ringing. Maybe it's a dog barking in the next room while you're trying to study. Maybe it's your friends are over and they're making a lot of noise. They're watching a football game, right? So there is external noise as well, and that can have the same impact in terms of your ability to understand a message and then provide feedback. So we now have updated models of communication which account for noise. That says, so instead of there being a sender who sends a message that is received by an audience who then provides feedback, there is a sender who now sends what we call an intended message, right? That's a key difference. Instead of just sending a message, it's now an intended message, meaning I have a message that I intend for you to receive in a particular way. However, because this noise exists, this internal and external noise is out there, you may not actually receive that message in the way that I intended it to be sent or to be received, right? You may not get the full message. You may not understand what I was really trying to say. So part of that is you have to decode that message, and you have to try to figure out, well, what is it that he's trying to say? So that noise has impacted that model of communication. We also have these ideas now, or these areas that we call field of experiences. And field of experience is important because it says we are who we are today because of everything that has happened to us up until this very instant and moment in our life, right? We are who we are because of everything that has happened to us. That is our field of experience. My field of experiences is likely very different from your field of experiences, right? We see the world through a slightly tinted lens. That lens is our experiences, right? You do see some overlap, right? Most people have some shared or common experiences that allow us to better understand certain areas or instances. You see this a lot in personal communication with relationships. For instance, someone may come from a relationship where their ex-partner was unfaithful. Maybe they were cheated on, right? And so they go into that next relationship and someone says something or they do something that the ex did before and it sets off red flags, right? Those red flags are set off because of our field of experiences. We have seen that before and it didn't work out well for us. So naturally, through our communication habits, we recognize those things and we say, hey, wait. This, I need to make sure that this isn't happening again. Now, that can be detrimental also, because maybe the new person that you're seeing or talking to, maybe they're not doing anything wrong, right? Maybe they're not the type of person to be unfaithful, right? And so we're applying our experiences onto them, and that can be challenging, right? So there is a downside or a dark side to that. But these field of experiences do matter. So let's end today's lecture by talking about why it's important that we study communication. And I think you can sort of see this through the conversations that we've already had. But it's important because good communication is associated with physical, emotional, and psychological health and well-being. People who are good communicators are generally healthier people, physically, emotionally, and psychologically. We study communication because strong speaking and listening skills is associated with greater health literacy, meaning we make better choices, we're smarter, we have a better understanding of what's going on around us and how that impacts us in our own lives. So it can help us with greater health literacy. The ability to communicate well is also fundamental to being able to fulfill your need for a satisfying identity. So what is it that you've set out in your life to accomplish? Who is it that you want to be? Right? You want to become that person, that better version of yourself, then the ability to communicate well is probably one of the most important things that you can have in that quest for having a satisfying identity. And then there's a very practical part of why we should study communication, and that's because employers and communications skills, our employers always say that communication skills are the most valuable ability employees can possess. You may be brilliant at your job. You may be great at what you do. But if you are not a good communicator, if you cannot communicate with your colleagues, if you cannot coexist and get along with them in a workplace environment, then unfortunately, you're not likely to have success in your jobs. A few last things is that communication is a primary influence on our relationships. So both our social relationships and our personal relationships. It is what creates, maintains, transforms, and ends personal relationships. You often ask people, wait, think about it. So communication, how could it create a relationship, right? You meet someone new, you don't go up to someone and take out a notepad and write, "Hi, what's your name?" right? No, you verbally speak. You use communication to start that relationship. Then maybe you exchange numbers and you text back and forth, right? And you use communication to maintain that relationship or to transform that relationship from maybe a friendship or someone that you really don't know to someone that maybe you want to date, right? And oftentimes, poor communication can end our personal relationships. You ask people, well, why did your relationships fail in the past? Friendships, romantic relationships, work relationships. Likely it was because of poor communication. So communication is the primary influence on our lives, and we see that every day. Communication skills are critical to building healthy and vibrant communities, and it's the foundation of democratic citizenship that often leads to social change and reform. You see it around you today. People are very passionate about issues that are important to them. Communication is the foundation for driving social change and reform in any country. So that's why we study communication. Later in the semester, we're going to study public speaking. You're going to have we're going to look at some of those elements there. And public speaking, being a good public speaker can empower you to have confidence and skills in communicating with other people, and it will also enhance your career and leadership opportunities. So in conclusion, that's our lesson for today. We looked at what communication is. It is a process that isn't spontaneous. We use it to the exchange of symbols for meaning, right? In our example of a car or a cat. And it is important in our personal relationships. It is important in the fulfillment of our own personal identities and in the success that we wish to have as individuals. So it really is the foundation for pretty much all that we do. If we think about it, maybe you've heard this phrase, you cannot not communicate, right? That means that everything that we do, we're constantly communicating, both verbally and non-verbally. So it's important for us to understand that, and it's important for us to study communication to help better us in all aspects of our life.